Good morning. I'm Charity Grace Moffson, and I am a member of the board for Nantucket Book Festival. Thank you all for joining us. I am so happy to introduce Skip Finley, author of Whaling Captains of Color. After many years as a broadcasting executive, Skip decided to retire and begin his next career, this time as an author. In his book, Skip chronicles stories from the lives of 50 whaling captains of color to share the story of America's first meritocracy. These are the stories that brought me to Nantucket. These are the stories that keep me here. We owe a huge amount of gratitude to Skip for sharing with the world what was previously hidden, forgotten, and at times completely discarded. May we all continue to pursue our history in all of its many forms. Skip, it is an honor.
Which is this working? Testing. Which seat would you like? It's your choice.
The one you don't take.
Well, let's see where you gravitate to.
Oh, good, yes.
Yeah. The bigger seat, right? It's like the king's seat.
I didn't even notice. But how appropriate.
Skip, first of all, I'm Michael Schulder, and I'm a journalist, and I've been a journalist my whole life, and to me, interviewing a historian, we often abuse the word breaking news, but very often historians really break news, and I think Skip Finley has broken news with his book, Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. And so, but I want to start on something very uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I just have to bring this up. A few weeks ago, the Nantucket Book Festival had its newsletter, and they had sort of fun facts about each author. And I read Skip Finley's fun fact: you were a go-go dancer. Skip, please tell us about this, not in too much detail.
I studied the martial arts when I was younger, stay in shape. I got into dance. By the time I got into college in my freshman year, they had opened a brand new, what they then called discotheques, called the Boston Tea Party on Berkeley Street. And we went there and had a ball, and it was wonderful. And I met another guy there who was also from New York. And we were the only two who could do the Philly dog, and before we knew it, we were surrounded by a bunch of really gorgeous, delectable young ladies who wanted to learn the dance. And the next thing I knew, I was in a pair of tights with no shirt on. Until my dad found out and decided that I should find other things to do with my free time.
Should we read anything into the fact that from go-go dancing, you went into the field of radio?
No, again, I had many paths along the way. My attention span is not that long. In fact, there's one thing I've said to myself for quite some time since I was coming here that I had to say to you folks on Nantucket. On the eve of Juneteenth, I don't know if you fully realize how responsible the island of Nantucket and the Friends of the Quakers are for the end of slavery in America. Slavery ended here 100 years before the Civil War. So thank all of your ancestors for me personally and the rest of my people.
And it was actually exactly 1 year ago today that President Biden signed into law making Juneteenth, June 19th, the official holiday commemorating the emancipation.
Yep. Well, if you live on Martha's Vineyard like I do, or Nantucket like you do, that's great to have a nice 3-day federal holiday between Memorial Day and July 4th weekend. Sorry for the traffic, but hey, we need the money.
So let me ask you, we spoke actually recently, and your book focuses, as Charity Grace said, on 50 whaling captains of color that you have identified. Even since that book has come out, you've identified more. But tell me, how did you get into this, and what clicked that said, I've just learned something and I've got to learn more?
I want to tell you that, wonderful apocryphal story, but, it's not going to be true. The truth is, I decided one day I wanted to be a writer. I wound up writing the Oak Bluffs Town column for the Vineyard Gazette. And one day, in honor of the Charles W. Morgan that had been, restored and relaunched, was coming to Martha's Vineyard. It was one of the most famous ships of our island, largely because I think it was 7 of its captains and 17 of its first crew members were all from Martha's Vineyard. So Paul Schneider, the editor of Martha's Vineyard magazine that my company owned, not my company, the company I work for owned, said, we're going to devote the entire issue to whaling in the Morgan, and would I write the story about the black whaling captain? Candidly, all I heard was write the story. So I got to write my first magazine story about someone I'd never heard of, and was astounded to find out a black guy got to be a whaling captain in the 1800s. And you know, I kind of suffer from ADHD and OCD simultaneously, so once I get into something, I don't want to do anything else. My wife is here and can tell you, oh, probably for the next 6 or 7 weeks, that's all I did was buy and read books about whaling to find out how the hell this guy got to be a captain.
And who was he again, and how did he get to be a captain?
His name was William A. Martin. I've since written more about him. Well, let me tell you his story. As it turned out, his great-grandmother, you know, may have been a witch, and she was the one, before you got on the ship, you wanted to have her blessing before your trip, so you would have a good trip. If you didn't get her blessing, you might not come back. You know, so it was a pretty easy choice. But he had a rough childhood. He wound up, you know, going into the whaling business and wound up becoming captain over those years, largely through, this was not a fun job that people wanted to do. You know, you went over and over and over only because you had to. You know, in fact, I like to say, the facts are 90% of the people who ever went whaling only went once. That's how bad it was. And of those, 40% deserted. So, well, it wasn't a fun business or a fun occupation at all. And the black guys really didn't have any other alternatives. They did trip after trip after trip, you know, which hence they wound up with the experience. And when something happened to the captain, the first mate, the boat steerer, then there was, the other person happened to be the black guy, and say, okay, can you get us home? Yeah, I can, let's go. And that's how the majority of these folks got, not all of them, but the majority got their jobs. Yes, there were some, you know, the father's sons, not that many. In fact, as I recall, there were about 3 of those. But at the end of the day, this was a job no one wanted to do, and the people who were doing it had no other jobs available to them.
And so give us an example of one more captain who just rose up through the ranks and just through sheer persistence. I mean, this is why you call it America's first meritocracy. So give us some more detail about what did they have to go through time after time to get in a position to get everyone home safely?
Okay, well, to describe the average whaling trip, it's something that took 3 to 4 years out of your life. In all that time, you may not get close enough to land to swim to shore because they knew you would desert. That's a pretty long time. In fact, the longest trip was 11 years and 10 months, if you can imagine being on a ship that would fit in this room for that amount of time. To imagine your personal space is roughly the size of the back seat of your SUV. And the conditions just sheerly awful. I could go on and on and on. Actually, there's a chapter, you know, in the book called "How Bad Was It?" Let me tell you, it was just terrible.
Just give us one example of how bad it was.
Probably the worst to me is, you know, a lot of whaling was conducted in temperate climate, so that, you know, you probably were sleeping nude in 100-degree weather, but you were covered by the, as it turned out, roaches you didn't mind because they ate the bed bugs that bit you. And you would think that was the worst, but that was until I found out, you know, that quite often they wash their clothes in urine. You know, which had, you know, the ammonia which had cut through the grease. Whale ships were covered with grease. You know, it was said you could smell a whale ship before you could see it, you know, coming over the horizon. Kind of suspect that's true. I have been on the Charles W. Morgan. I was on that for about 15 minutes, and that was long enough. I have no desire to ever put my feet on a whale ship again, now that what I know about it. But interesting, one of the characters in the book, it was just such a striking example of the nature of meritocracy. Valentino Rosa was his name. He's from Cabo de Verde. He was aboard a ship. He'd worked his way up to first officer, to first mate. The captain liked him and liked his work. At the time, this is one of the rare times when the captain brought his wife aboard, and the wife was a navigator for the trip. She also liked him, and she taught him to navigate, which is how he became a captain once, you know, you learn that fundamental skill. You know, because 1,200 miles away from home in the middle of the sea, all you need to do is know how to get home, not which direction it might be in. So many years passed, Valentine Rosa became a captain himself. Several years later, he was on a ship with his wife. She became the navigator. It's called the Morning Star. And I'm sorry to say, the ship crashed, on the rocks in a storm, and she was driving. No, I'm being funny. She was the navigator, so it takes the weight. Everyone came home safely. But that was one that impressed me. All these men had very interesting stories. But there weren't a lot of folks writing about black people in the 17 and the 1800s, as you can imagine, including them themselves, the few that could read, and were literate. So it wasn't that easy to find this information. Pictures are almost impossible to find. If it wasn't for the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the Nantucket Historical Association, we would have no information about whaling whatever. I guarantee that.
And so many things struck me about this book, but just the idea that the term for a whaling captain was master, and that black people were masters of their ship and people followed their orders is unbelievable. But at the same time, they did not have total control. It was a huge risk because they could not dock, as I learned from your book, in a southern port. There was a huge risk to that. Nope. There were other risks. They were free men technically, but always in danger.
Always. Consider the nature of the word master aboard a whale ship. People don't think about that, so often. That's fundamentally another word for omniscient. The captain of a whale ship could do anything he wanted to maintain control so they could conduct their business. And when I say that, they didn't even outlaw flogging until 1850, excuse me. All right, imagine you could flog a person for not doing what they were told as soon as I told you to do it. I could flog you. But I think the penultimate example was the medicine kit. This is a wooden box they had filled with things that today are, by the way, fundamentally illegal to give to humans, but that the master would use to treat anyone who was sick aboard ship, because he was the captain, he was the everything. Master, very completely says it. So there's one instance when clearly what was called for some sickness or something one of the crewmen had, they needed a number 11. And the captain went to the box and there was no 11, so he got a number 5 and a number 6 and mixed them together. The dude lived somehow. But that was the power that your whale ship captain had over you for at least the 3 years of your whaling voyage. Not all whaling voyages were that long. As the years wore on, there were trips from Provincetown, for example, that, folks only went out for, 6 or 7 months. They would do that in order to beat the weather, to get there before the bad weather and get home before the bad weather, in the north. But the pretty much everything I learned about whaling was a minute short of frightening. Not just bizarre, but, you gotta be kidding, in all of humanity, how can this be? But the products they brought back, were so valuable, we need them so much. Today we say whalebone and kind of casually toss that off. Most people don't know what that is. Whalebone's a material that hangs from the roof of a whale's mouth. It's generally keratin, the same thing as your fingernails, but it's big, long, 14 to 21 feet long. When that material is harvested from the whale and it's bent into a shape and heated, it retains that shape. Today we call that plastic. That's what spring steel was, but we didn't have spring steel. And that obviates the oil, which is what brought them out there in the first place, which they use for heat and light. This was the product that fundamentally lit America and certainly the Northeast.
So let me ask you that in terms of, you started with this story of one black whaling captain, and you pursued your curiosity, and you came up with 50, and it's 50 and still counting. Who was the next most fascinating person you came across that you really want us to know about?
William Shorey.
Wait, William who?
William Shorey.
Tell me.
William Shorey, apparently born in the West Indies, from Provincetown, traveled to San Francisco during the whaling moved to the West Coast principally as a result of the gold rush, not because they chased the whales that far, which is a great story. But no, that was why. But in the 1850s, a lot of people went there. William Shorey was one of those. He conducted some 20-some trips as captain, which is astounding. You know, that's some kind of a record. I haven't studied all 2,500 whale ship captains, and that's how many there were, who took 15,913 whaling trips, each of which was a completely different business enterprise, different management, different crew, different investors, different owners, you know, and so on. But for him to have taken, you know, 60-some trips, 20-some trips as captain was just astounding. Since my book has been published, you know, people have taken other looks at whaling. One lady from, I should remember her name, from Princeton University did a new study on, because no one ever found out how profitable was whaling. You know, we kind of gratuitously think, oh, whaling, it built Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and all this money and all this profit, but how profitable was it? In fact, she imputed that the profitability of whaling was roughly equivalent to the, you know, to the U.S. bond, about 4.6, 4.7%. That's not a lot of money to take your life in your hands. You know, now, yes, people did substantially better. William Shorey, I'll get back to that. You know,
4.6% profit margin per year.
Profit margin per year, right? Or in this case, it was per trip. You know, for each trip. You know, well, as it turned out, so I said, you know, wow, that's you know, it's fabulous. I'm the first one probably to say that whaling was a $10 or $11 billion industry in today's money, so we would be able to grasp, you know, what that meant. You know, so, you know, $10 billion, even today, you know, that's a bunch. Back then, that was huge. It made, you know, New Bedford, you know, the wealthiest city per capita in the entire world. Back to the subject at hand, though. Excuse me. There's just so much of this information, it's hard to, you know, get one fact out. So William Shorey's returns, well, all of whaling was 4.6%. William A. Martin was 11.7. Joe Gonzalez, you know, was about 12 or 18. William Shorey's returns were 63%. So here's a man who captained 20 whaling voyages, and you know that you're going to get to keep 63% of the money when he got back. That's who you want to hire as your captain. But of course, we didn't know any of this information until relatively recently. And there's more information to come. We have, you know, thanks to a host of amazing circumstances, again, that lead right back here to Nantucket. You know, one of the first all-black whaling trips was on the ship industry. I know you've heard of that, you know, before. Well, another industry was sunk in the Gulf of Mexico, and James Delgado and the folks at Earth Search, and you've seen the TV show Drain the Oceans. Well, they found a whale ship in the Gulf of Mexico called the Industry, which I thought was this, and turns out it wasn't. But the story got even better because it had a sister ship named the Elizabeth, and the Elizabeth went down, you know, was whaling with it, and it brought all the men back to New Bedford safely. Well, as it turns out, there were several people, black men, who owned that ship, the Elizabeth, along the way, and many who served on both of those ships. Well, as it turned out, one of the guys I wrote about in the book, you know, Richard Johnson, you know, was more of an investor than a whaler, I thought at that point. Come to find out, not only was a whaler, but he owned 40 whaling investments, whaling ships, whaling trips himself, and is one of the people in there. And he had about a dozen guys who worked for him. So, you know, there's going to be another study at some point. I'm, you know, kind of convinced Michael Harrison to do a piece with me for maybe Sea History magazine and talk about this new discovery and some of these other folks.
Let me ask you, because, you know, the subject of black wealth and restrictions, so sort of systemic restrictions to making that intergenerational wealth, did any of this whaling money, any of these few fortunes that were created among black and people of color whaling captains, did that get passed down through the generations, or were there just too many obstacles for that?
It was never a question of it being a possibility. Again, consider the times. You know, this is the Victorian era. Most of whaling occurred before the Civil War, you know, even began. These folks had no options. So if you came home with $100,000, you know, you couldn't buy anything. No one would sell you anything. You know, whaling was an option for a lot of these folks because, you know, their brother didn't own a store, their dad didn't own a farm where they could go.
When you said no one would sell you anything, I mean, be even more specific about that, because that's sort of amazing to me that you could have money and not be able to use it.
white folks had no incentive to sell black people anything. You know, nowadays we use the expression NIMBY. Well, imagine in the 1800s and a brother wants to buy the house next door. You're not going to let that happen. And that's how things were. I don't know that from firsthand experience. I haven't had that in my background, certainly. You know, but I can read just like y'all can, and that's how things were. To my knowledge, there are only 2 physical representations left of all of these black whaling captains. One is the House of William Shorey, which is on the Historical Register in Oakland, California. And the other is Captain William A. Martin's house, the first guy I started with, which is owned by a private party on Chappaquiddick Island off of Martha's Vineyard. That is in total disrepair. It's probably not going to last.
So now let me ask you, because you spent how many years now digging into these whaling stories?
It was in March 2014 when Paul Schneider said, "Did I want to write the piece about this black whaling?"
So this is, you know, we're here on our 10th anniversary. You're got 8th anniversary of studying whaling. Yeah. But let me go farther back because, you know, we always ask writers, like writers always start as readers. And you've got a great origin story for your reading. You were a sick child.
Yeah.
And just tell us how you became a voracious reader.
I was gifted with asthma and allergies, you know, at a very young age. And, you know, I missed the entire 2nd grade. My mom had to homeschool me because I was in and out of the hospital so much. And, you know, back then they didn't have cures. The stuff they gave you, you know, they like for your allergies, they gave you speed, fundamentally. But I was a sick
Did they
kid.
give you a number 5 plus a number 6
No.
so for an 11?
They gave me the 12. So my mom would read to me when I was home, you know, and after a while, unfortunately, you know, she had who became my sister, and she required time too, so I just started reading on my own, you know, at a pretty young, I don't know how old I was, probably around 5 years old, 4 or 5, you know, 6 years old, and I could read, you know, what today you'd call a college textbook. And because that was what I also did, you know, my gift was I read very quickly. I think in the 8th grade, they clocked me at 1,200 words a minute. They made me do the test again. You know, I did it quicker the second time, as I recall. But that certainly helped, you know, so that when a month after I started doing my study on whaling captains, my wife Karen comes into my office and says, whoa, you know, you spent like $1,400 on Amazon last month, what's going on? Sidebar, I'm not a very mature person. I have an ATM card and an allowance. Other than that, I have no access to money. But thank God for the internet and Amazon, I can get books. So, and this, what are you doing? So I said, you know, there's this black whaling captain. I'm trying to find out how he got to be one. I'm writing a story about it, you know, for the magazines. Okay, you know, he's busy, he's occupied, he's not in trouble, and his immaturity is not manifesting himself in any worse ways. I mean, that's what happened.
So listen, so this avid, I'm going to open it up to questions in just a minute, but so this avid reader, you grew up, you clearly got through school, and you wound up in the radio industry, and maybe you could tell us, I don't know if that was one of America's great meritocracies, but you rose to become, if I'm not mistaken, was it the first black vice chair of the National Association of Broadcasters?
Yes.
Tell us about, just briefly, before we open it up to questions, what did you accomplish in the radio industry?
I owned, I was responsible for 40-some stations in 18 markets. Most of the stations I was responsible for at some point in time became #1 in their markets. I was a pretty good competitor, according to everyone who didn't compete with me. It was fun. It was just something that I liked to do. It wasn't, you know, going to school and pounding books and things. I quit college 5 weeks before graduation, to the delight of my parents, both of whom are college educated, and took a job at WHDH-TV, the old WHDH-TV, before Natalie, when she was at CVB, in 1971. And never looked back. This is, this was a business that was suited for me, and it didn't really matter. So I was recruited to go into radio, and never really looked back. But it was a lot of fun. But you didn't have to really do anything. You had to win.
Well, listen, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I will actually bring the microphone so we can hear your questions. So remember Phil Donahue used to do that, right?
Yeah.
I'll try to do that, but who has any questions for Skip Finley? Okay, oh, a fellow historian who, see, this is the thing about fact-checking this guy. How can you possibly fact-check him? It's all original research. But we have a historian here who, if anybody's going to fact-check Skip Finley, so introduce yourself for everyone and let us know.
Oh, hi, I'm Betsy Tyler.
Hey, Betsy.
Hey, Skip.
I know you.
Yeah.
I love your book. Oh, my goodness. Yes.
Nice to see you. How did you identify these captains as men of color? Because I know in so many records, there's no identification of race.
No, that was, well, first was what we call kind of generally the crew list. When you boarded a whale ship, you know, a customs officer, the captain, and a government official or someone would write down your physical characteristics so they would know who you were. These certificates were actually developed, early in the game of America because the British, as you recall, would impress our seamen. And we didn't have passports then, so at least we could prove we were Americans with this seaman certificate, you know, as it was called. On there, they identified you, you know, by how you looked, your, you know, race and color. And they didn't often match. And as a matter of fact, the reason that the book's name is Whaling Captains of Color is because I couldn't determine, you know, who was black or Cabo de Verdean or, you know, whatever. Because people from Cabo de Verde don't consider themselves to be black, you know, and people from the West Indians don't consider themselves to be Americans. And in those years, there was no such thing as an African American. I like to say now, we didn't become Americans till 1965 and we could vote. You know, so that, you know, saying an American slave is kind of a promotion, you know, kind of, you know, painting something with a, you know, with a brush that it didn't really deserve, if you will.
And by the way, on that subject of color, one of the things I learned from your book, I never had any idea how many marriages there were between black people and Native Americans and what the underlying reason for that was. Just give us 1 minute on that.
One of the more insidious things, you know, I found, you know, quite, because I asked the same question, the penultimate results, there was a thing called the Earl Report back in the 1800s that was conducted in the state of Massachusetts and on Martha's Vineyard Island. Martha's Vineyard, as you know, we have Wampanoags and everybody else. You know, they were the first ones, you know, 9,000 years ago, got here long before the rest of us did. But the Earl Report found that there were no Native Americans on Martha's Vineyard, you know, in the 1800s. And, you know, how can that be? Well, the Native Americans and black people were encouraged to intermarry for a couple of reasons. One is it took the Native American off of Native American lands so that could be sold to white folks, you know, and two, it kept the black man, you know, where they were. So at some point in time, you know, how can you tell? I meet people today and I have no clue, you know, where they're from. You know, and then when you look at the descriptions of these men in the Seamen's Protection Certificates, you know, black, brown, yellow, and so on and so on and so on. You know, who makes that determination? You know, there's an expression, you know, few of you may be familiar with called hypodescence. You know, or that what was used to called in the days of slavery the one-drop rule. And that meant if you had one drop of black blood in you, okay, you could be a slave. You know, so there was a financial reason, you know, for this abuse over all this time. And it wound up having its way and impacting, you know, several things. You know, I could show up somewhere in the middle of Africa. I don't know if anybody would think I was from there, you know.
Any other questions?
Over here.
I'll go over to you. Skip's wife, right there. Karen. She's the one with the patience. She approved the $1,400 Amazon charge.
I'm the good one, though.
Ex post facto.
I'm the good one.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Is there anything that you can tell us about relative to Shoring's huge difference in profitability compared to the average? Like what were some of the things that he did that were so spectacular and profitable?
The number of voyages as captain, certainly, you know, for the more opportunities that you have. There's a book written by a man named Walter Noble. I forget the name of it offhand, but he wrote a book about his trip with William A. Shorey. So you learn quite a bit more about him than you would have about the other captains. And dude was absolutely ruthless. You miss sticking a whale. He'd smack you with his gun. He wasn't a really good guy. He's a great captain. William Shorey, I do have printed, written evidence of him whipping people, flogging people well after 1850 and got away with it. He was brought up on charges a couple of times, but it could only have been. The times were different. You weren't leaving from the East Coast and going on 10,000-mile trips. He was leaving from San Francisco, going north up and towards the Aleutians. So there were shorter trips. So he was able to take more of them. But whether blessed, lucky, or talented, he wound up with the highest production. His production is so much higher than the industry is astounding. Astounding.
Let me ask you before I get another question. So I'm looking at my empty chair there, and I'm wondering if you could have one whaling captain there and had one question that you've been digging through the archives and you have not been able to find the answer. Please ask him a question. Why
did you take that second trip? What the hell were you thinking? No, really, it's. I wish the Island of Nantucket knew how truly blessed you are. Well, no, excuse me. The Friends, the Quakers built your island, okay? But whaling built its economy. I mean, out of everything else. There's a lot of islands in this world. There's a lot of whales, swimming in it. This is truly, truly outstanding.
Other questions? Yes.
Here in the front.
Hi, my name is Alice Leventhal. I really think you're terrific and have so much stories to tell, and I'd love to hear more of them. I can't imagine that you don't have another story that you're working on. You can't sit still, so what is it?
I'm pursuing this one, but I'm pursuing this in different ways. I am working on a children's version of the information of the book. I am working in a multi-part documentary. One may become a fictional version who's a slave who becomes a whaling captain. And in it, I'm going to try to incorporate as much of the events that have happened to these men in that story as I can. Or I'll make a pretty cool story.
Yeah.
In the immediate future, though, I'm focused on these other dozen captains. And we know it wasn't cool to be a slave. It wasn't cool to be black. Apparently, a lot of people could have been lighter in skin or in appearance and became captains. We don't know yet that they were black. Okay, so, I'm sure there are many, many stories like that we're going to find at some point. So I keep my eye out. I'd love to tell you, I'm still reading about it, but I think I own all the whaling books now. I'm up to 180. Yes, I did read Moby Dick a few times when I was younger, just because I had nothing else at the time and I was sick and couldn't get to the library. It's a wonderful book, however. It's one of the most literate pieces of writing you're ever going to read. It's a little long.
Picking up on her question, because it is fascinating. You are such a outgoing guy, a big personality, and it fascinates me to meet big personalities who spend hours and hours alone in the archives. How do you mix those two parts of you?
Last few years, I spent a lot of time trying to find ways to bring those archives onto my computer. In some practical, discussable terms, and in others. If I can find a back door, into your archives, I'm probably going to do that instead of having to go there. I spent a lot of time and money. I'm proud of it. I guess I spent about $40,000 on this book so far. And it could have been a boat, it could have been a drug habit. What the hell? So I'm kind of proud of it, but no, I'm not going to stop.
We have another question here.
Two questions. The first is, my understanding is a large majority of the crew were very young boys, 14 to 17 years old. Is that true?
The median age of a whaler was below 20.
Okay. And
All whaling, all 175,000 of them.
are there examples of those 50 captains that actually parlayed the experience they had as a captain into a second career at all?
Not that I've been able to find. Not that I've been able to find. You know, and I don't say that, you know, with askance or disappointment. You know, it was the times. You know, at some point, you know, we all have to be realistic about, you know, that was then, this is how it was. What I try to do is to try to find those stories and write about those people who gave hope, all right, to provide agency to people today. You know, if you know, I wouldn't have been a good slave. You know, that's the deal. You know, I wouldn't have survived through it, or no one else would have. But if you're out in the fields and you see Paul Cuffey sail up the Nanticoke River with a whole crew filled with black people, you don't even know what you're looking at. You know, how do I get there? Does that give you the hope to survive, you know, this maltreatment you've had for all of your life to get to where we are today? You know, the math is fairly simple. 399,000 people were brought from Africa to here in conterminous America. 3.9 million people were released honoring Juneteenth this weekend. So we went and got these seeds and grew these like they were fruit. Turned out they were people, but we grew them and treated them like fruit. They were the currency of our country. Okay, you know, people don't, you know, dig down. You want to dig down. There's an entire industry of making clothes in southern New England for slaves. You'd ever wonder how they all wear the same uniform? They weren't in the army. So that's how it was. How did those people get to today? How did I get here today? How did, you know, my dad, who's from Mobile, Alabama, okay, you know, become a successful man and to, you know, provide multiple homes and a home in Martha's Vineyard for my family and a graduate degree in engineering. How did he have that? What instilled that into him so he could have a son to quit college and be happy about it? You want to take one more? And
I think we've got 3 more minutes. I see somebody who has not asked.
She said 2 more minutes, but all right.
I apologize in advance because I think this is like a 3-tiered question. So is the whaling industry more well documented compared to doing other historical research?
Whaling industry is more documented. I haven't studied many industries, but it's extraordinarily well extraordinarily well detailed.
And then how does the experience of, like, the black experience, is that accounted for in that historical?
It's not.
So then what are your, like, clues or tricks to figure out if it's somebody who was black?
In my case, it was sheer luck. Absent my book, you know, not that this is some important historical literary milestone, but absent my book, there is no other information. You know, many things about black whaling captains, you can Google them and you're going to sooner or later get my name. I'd say probably in the first 3. That's how little information there is. But again, it's only 50 people in the history of the world that we know about so far, so it's not that big a deal. It turns out it's a huge industry, and it's a big deal to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and New Bedford, obviously. Other than that, it doesn't have that much, you know, I would say, significance. But it is a kind of cool and interesting story, and I'm glad you all liked it. And thank you if any of you bought my book. And I know this is Nantucket, you can afford a dozen.
So we have time now. We have 15 minutes for everybody to buy books, to get them signed. I guess I have one final question for you. Looking at that chair again, you reveal that you're going to write a story for children about this. You've got how many grandchildren?
Oh, goodness. 5 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren.
Okay, so listen, we're not going to hold you to this. Opening line of your book for your grandchildren who are sitting on each other's laps right there. Opening line.
I hope you find your way to a career that can afford this book.
Skip Finley, thank you so much.